Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, a practical tool for coastal communities to manage climate change impacts. This webinar is part of Canada's Climate Change Adaptation Platform webinar series, which showcases projects and products available under the Adaptation Platform, Building Regional Adaptation Capacity and Expertise Program in Canada in a Changing Climate. The webinar is made possible with support from Natural Resources Canada. My name is John Somerville, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. I'm a policy analyst at Natural Resources Canada. I'm joining you today from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I would encourage you to add your own land acknowledgement in the chat bar. Claire Sanders at the Climate Risk Institute will be available during the webinar if you run into any audio or technical issues. To ask her a question, open the chat box using the drop-down arrow, locate Claire Sanders, and you can send her a private message. Please note that your microphones have been automatically muted to avoid any audio distractions or feedback during the webinar. There will be a dedicated Q&A at the end of the webinar, but don't hold your questions till then. You can post them in the chat bar and we'll reach them at the end of the presentations. We are recording the webinar today, and we will be sending out a link to everyone who has registered, along with a copy of the presentation slides. The project and resources presented today were funded under NRCan's Climate Change Adaptation Program's Call for Proposals in 2017 under a theme to develop alternative and innovative options to hard protection infrastructure solutions. This call was informed by priorities established by the Adaptation Platform's Coastal Management Working Group. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. Michelle Molnar. Michelle is the Technical Director at the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. Michelle has over 15 years experience in ecological economics and interdisciplinary research focusing on conservation of natural capital using valuation, policy analysis, and public outreach. She's created and managed cross-functional teams, authored natural capital valuation reports, is past president of the Canadian Society of Ecological Economics, and served on the BC government's Climate Solutions and Clean Growth Advisory Council. Michelle will be followed by Michelle Lewis. Michelle is a natural asset technician at the town of Gibsons, a municipality at the forefront of natural asset management. Her role is unique to Gibsons. It's a position dedicated solely to monitoring, maintaining, and planning around Gibsons' natural assets. She's an ISA certified arborist and is currently pursuing her master's in urban forestry leadership at UBC. Finally, we'll have James Borman. James is a geomatics manager at Plan 360, the land planning division at the Southeast Regional Service Commission in New Brunswick. James and his team provide a wide range of geospatial solutions to the 13 municipalities and surrounding rural areas serviced by Plan 360. Over the past 10 years, James has managed collaborative pilot projects to advance land use planning in the region. And these pilots have focused on adaptation to coastal and inland flooding and the use of natural assets to provide municipal services. He has a Bachelor of Geodesy and Geomatics Engineering and a Master of Science in Forestry, both from the University of New Brunswick. So on behalf of everyone joined today, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our panelists. We really appreciate them taking the time to present today. So without further delay, I'll turn things over to Michelle.
There we go. Okay, thank you, John. I'll start with today's agenda. It's fairly simple. I'm going to provide a project overview, give you an indication of what we were aiming for with this project, and then we will hear from each community who tested our model and our approach. So we'll start with Michelle Lewis, who will speak to the town of Gibson's experience, and then turn it to James Borman to speak to Pointe-aux-Chenes experience. And he's also going to provide us a little more discussion on the Coastal Toolbox model and kind of walk you through how they used it. I'll wrap up with some of the lessons we learned and what we're thinking about currently for next steps. And then that should allow us about 15 minutes for any questions you have and for discussion. Let me start with the project rationale. This project really started a little over 5 years ago when MNAI sent out a survey, and the results showed that coastal issues were top of mind for local governments. Now, this perhaps isn't surprising given that Canada has the world's longest coastline and what we're hearing about coastal hazards under climate change. So rising sea levels threaten coastal zones through a range of coastal hazards, including more frequent or intense coastal flooding and coastal erosion. And that's occurring today in many areas, as we'll hear. In the medium to long term, communities are thinking about the permanent submergence of land and the loss of coastal ecosystems. They're also starting to think about saltwater intrusion into soils, into surface and groundwater. So over the next century, we're told that without adaptation, the vast majority of low-lying communities and coasts will face substantial risks from these hazards. Now, to address this, some communities are seeking new strategies to address risks while delivering core services in a financially sustainable manner. And those communities are often considering nature-based approaches, and more specifically, natural infrastructure to do this. And this is because nature-based approaches for addressing climate change have some unique advantages. They have embedded flexibility that allows for greater degrees of uncertainty in future climatic and environmental conditions. And they've been shown to deliver a wide range of social, environmental, and economic co-benefits, ultimately maximizing overall returns on investment. And furthermore, nature-based approaches contribute to strengthening the adaptive capacity of the communities that they're intended to serve while reducing risks associated with climate change. So the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, or MNAI, is a not-for-profit organization whose mission is to make natural asset management a mainstream practice across Canada, and ultimately make the case that, like any asset, natural assets need to be carefully managed to ensure a sustainable supply of services. So with that said, our project goal of the Coastal Resilience Project was to help participating local governments better understand coastal natural assets as part of core local government natural asset management systems. And to do this, we created a simulation model called the Coastal Toolbox that can help communities understand the relevant natural assets, understand the value of those natural assets, and use that information in municipal planning and management decisions. So that toolbox was tested with 2 coastal communities possessing very different coastlines. Town of Gibsons in British Columbia and the community of Pointe-du-Chien in New Brunswick. Now I'm going to speak briefly to the model, as well as a guidance document that we've developed to accompany the model. But before I do that, I just want to quickly recognize the people and the organizations who were involved in this project, because this project really did take a village. I'll start with the funders who made it possible. That included Natural Resources Canada, that included the Sitkut Foundation, the McLean Foundation, the Bullet Foundation, and the Province of New Brunswick's Environmental Trust Fund. And then on the left-hand side, I've also provided a list of contributors. And this list could have been much longer, but I was working with space. So I want to recognize the project team. It was a multidisciplinary team that included systems ecologists, coastal engineers, modelers, GIS analysts, and economists. I want to recognize the communities we worked with, as well as some regional folks like the Southeast Regional Service Commission, and they were really essential in bringing that local context and that local expertise. And I should mention that this project was also informed by provincial and federal representatives, local not-for-profit organizations, and residents of each location. So let me turn to the model that we built for this. When we entered this project, we were really trying to look for a model that struck a balance between technical rigor and ease of use. We wanted a tool that captured the impact of natural assets on coastal flooding and erosion while being accessible to medium and small-sized governments. So the coastal toolbox, what we ended up with, was designed as a rapid first pass assessment that minimizes processing time while still permitting a general indication of coastal protection benefits from natural assets. And ultimately, it supports community learning about how those assets can affect coastal processes. Now, the model was built by modifying the open source INVEST coastal protection module from Stanford University's Natural Capital Project. And we did that with the assistance of the model's original architect. And we modified it for the Canadian environment. And what it does is it estimates how different habitats reduce nearshore wave energy and coastal erosion. The model accepts a baseline scenario as well as proposed scenarios and compares the two. However, I should be clear about what it does not do. It does not consider cross-cutting effects from wind and waves that are more complex and computationally intensive. Nor does it consider dynamic effects like sediment transport over time. So the goal with this model was really to provide an end-to-end evaluation that traces the impacts of biophysical processes on coastal ecosystems through to cost or benefit estimates associated with the ecosystem services affected. Assessments with this model will help communities decide whether more detailed studies are warranted. It'll aid in community outreach and education and inform the design and development of asset management policies that consider coastal natural assets. Now, we also developed a guidance document to walk potential users through the model, but also to situate it within the natural asset management process. So the first part of this guidance document provides advice on getting started. It answers questions like how to pull a team together, how to develop an inventory and assess the condition of your coastal assets, and what data to gather, where you might find that data. The second part of the document includes a step-by-step procedural guide for using the toolbox. And the final section provides guidance around how to interpret the results. There are also several appendices that provide additional details about things like specific modeling steps, coastal ecosystems and the services they provide, common strategies for storm surge protection, both gray, green, and hybrid approaches, and a list of relevant legislation and policy. The guidance document is available in both English and French. Before we get through the slides, I'll be sure to provide you links to the model, to the guidance document, as well to the case studies. But I think it would be great to hear from the two communities we worked with about how this played out in their communities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle Lewis.
Thank you, Michelle. I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm calling in today from the town currently known as Gibsons on the Squamish territory on the west coast of British Columbia. So why Gibsons and why now? The Gibsons foreshore, we recognize that it provides an important seawall that protects the water from the consequences of climate change. particularly the unavoidable effects of storm surges and sea level rise. If the storm surges and sea level rise negatively impact the foreshore, we recognize that engineered alternatives would be required and the costs associated would be extensive. In 2014, the town of Gibsons completed a foreshore condition assessment, which provided recommendations for a long-term master plan for the redevelopment of the foreshore. And then together with M&AI and ESSA Technologies, we were looking to understand the implications of these climate-related events and specifically what role, if any, natural assets could play in the protection of the foreshore. Next slide, please, Michelle. The options that were modeled were not able to provide much protection against flooding because of the characteristics of the typical storm in Gibsons. We did detect wave attenuation service being provided by eelgrass. We detected a potential erosion reduction benefit from beach enhancements, such as shoreline plantings for the south side of Gibsons. But we did recognize that because of the differences of the ecologies of the sites explored in Gibsons, the impacts and benefits varied. What provided benefit to the south side beaches did not necessarily apply to the marina side. But we do know that the long-term value of natural assets is greater from their cumulative protection over time from smaller, more frequent storms than from the large, infrequent storms that are making headlines these days. And also don't forget the co-benefits. Just because they say the eelgrass wasn't necessarily providing much flood protection, it still is providing habitat provision, nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, and in combination with all of the other natural assets explored in this modeling, the co-benefits were substantive. Next slide, please. So next steps for Gibsons. The Coastal Resilience Project helped us understand the role of natural assets as coastal infrastructure to provide protection from storm surges and erosion. And currently, the town of Gibsons is undertaking a Source to Sea project, which is a watershed scale natural asset project. We hope to integrate the results of the Coastal Resilience Project with the Source to Sea project, taking into consideration how the systems are connected. The overarching goal of both of the projects is to understand, measure, value, and manage the natural assets to protect their health, and thus ensure a reliable flow of municipal services, such as mentioned before by Michelle, as well as the provision of diverse co-benefits. The project results from the Coastal Resilience Project will inform our own restoration work over the coming years with recommendations for reimagining and redeveloping the foreshore. And this, I wanted to point out, could include exploring planned or managed retreat. Also, this will require a strategic thinking approach. I find that too often municipalities imagine a future that they want and then work backward to understand the steps needed to get there. But by performing scenario modeling, it forces us to challenge our way of thinking and to explore multiple and differing futures. This can help guide municipalities when we have a better understanding of the possible outcomes. And with that, I will pass it over to James from Pointe de Chêne.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here today, and I'm glad to share my experience. Before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge gratefully that I'm joining you all from the unceded and territorial lands of the Mi'kmaq peoples. And so to begin, I just wanted to give a bit of a background about how we got involved in this project. As John mentioned at the beginning, I work for the Southeast Regional Service Commission, which provides land planning services to multiple communities. And we applied to this project as one of our regional initiatives. Our initiatives allow us to test out either a topic or apply a method in a single community that benefits land planning that we can then apply across the region. In the past number of years, I've been involved with meeting initiatives related to coastal and inland flooding, climate change adaptation, and natural asset management. So we're very excited to apply to this project to learn more about strategies to reduce coastal flood risk and erosion. We're also very much interested in the modeling tool that we could use to apply science-based evidence approaches to not only explore different nature-based solutions, but also see how those solutions may change with sea level rise, and also how they may combine with various land planning bylaws or regulations that can also adapt to reduce the flood risk. Next slide, please. This map shows where Pointe du Chêne in our region is situated in the world. We're at the southeast corner of New Brunswick, bordering Nova Scotia, and across the Northumberland Strait is Prince Edward Island. We've got over 470 kilometers of coastline, both on the Bay of Fundy side and the Northumberland Strait. And while these areas are provide stunning and beautiful landscapes that provide economic opportunities for tourism and fisheries, and are beautiful places where people want to visit and live, those activities will have to be balanced with the risks associated in these coastal areas and are increasing with climate change. Next slide, please. So here's an aerial view of Pointe du Chêne. Pointe du Chêne is in an unincorporated area next to the town of Shediac. It's got about 700 residents. This increases in the summer with seasonal residents and tourists to this area. Shown in bright green here is Parley Beach Provincial Park, which is one of the greatest tourist attractions in the province that sees hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. One of the defining features of the park is the beach and dune environment that's in part sustained by a beach nourishment program that where sediment is moved from east to west. The beach nourishment program moves the sand manually to the eastern side of the beach to help sustain that ecosystem. Pointe du Chêne is also very lone-lying, like many other communities in our region, and unfortunately has been, since 2003, has been subject to 3 large storms that's caused flooding and erosion, and these impacts are increasing with climate change. Next slide, please. And here's just a visual of the area. This is picture taken from showing the beach, the dunes, and the vegetation in the Parley Beach. There's also a natural coastline of low-lying cliffs, and then some other areas with a hardened shoreline to protect residents and roads. Next slide. I just wanted to quickly mention the participants in the project. This was it was really great to have so many people involved, but there are also some challenges. You know, where this is an unincorporated area, there weren't municipal staff to draw upon, so we had other local knowledge and subject matter expertise from the provincial and Canadian government, and as well as local representatives as well from a local watershed group and some other groups. It was also challenging. We started this project at the beginning of the pandemic, and we had hoped to have more stakeholder involvement, but we're moving online. We wanted to limit the group size to about 20 people to ensure that everyone had a chance to participate effectively. But I found the group of people were extremely valuable. I found we learned a lot from each other, the stakeholders contributed a lot throughout the process, from identifying the different scenarios to model, and then also feedback in terms of making sure that the model results made sense. Next slide. So here are some of the scenarios that were modeled through the project. These involved improvements to the dunes, such as looking if they were made wider or taller or more stable, examining the impacts of the beach nourishment program that makes the foreshore slope less steep and can reduce wave heights, and then looking at strategies related to shoreline planting, again, to stabilize shorelines. The project team was interested in looking at a theoretical eelgrass planting, which wasn't a practical solution in this area, but it was interesting to see how that could affect the modeling results. And then also looking at submerged structures as well. So some of the key findings, it was found that the greatest impact that natural asset solutions have would be in reducing erosion. This could be through strategies such as shoreline planting, beach nourishment, or dune improvements. These strategies could reduce erosion by between 40 to 60%, which is quite substantial. Interestingly, from the flood protection perspective, natural assets were much less effective, only reducing flooding by about 1 to 4%. But however, because the areas, the flood damages that are estimated over 100 years could be as much as 182 million. Any improvements to reduce flooding can have a large financial benefits. If we think about that in a different way, it's also saying that while natural assets can't prevent flooding, it can certainly, they're beneficial solutions to look at to help reduce damages. Again, like in Gibson's, the greatest benefit that natural assets had were to be found in the smaller, more frequent storms, and also that the co-benefits, almost regardless of the flood and erosion benefits, the stakeholders in the project all agreed that they had benefits for tourism, recreation, and habitat value as well. So now what I was going to do is I'm just going to switch gears a bit and just show you how the model can be applied. So the model was built to run in a ArcGIS Pro environment, software, sorry. This is a common software used by local governments of medium to larger size. And what you're seeing here on the map is the different input layers required to run the model. It requires a elevation map that shows both the offshore depths and the elevation of the land. There's information about the shoreline characteristics, whether that's the dunes, the vegetation type, or the if it's a hardened shoreline. Those informations are provided there. And then there's also a building layer that's used to calculate flood damages. On the right-hand side, there's a number of parameters used to run the model. I found that the guidance document was really important. That's really important to review it before running the model to understand the model strengths and limitations. And then it also provides, can walk you through where you can get data for each step, and also how you would enter the parameters such as, and there's parameters such as the tide levels that you want to model during a storm, storm duration, return period, and aspects around sea level rise. Next slide. And one of the great things about this model is it's very quick to run. The model ran in under 2 minutes, so it can be used in in a meeting or a small group setting to aid in discussion. So you can see some results and you can ask questions. What if we change the have more vegetation planting, for example, and change the settings and run it again and get the results quite quickly. And one of the things to note, here are two of the spatial outputs. You have these lines, which are the profile lines, and these are the lines that the model generates the storm model for, and then it can interpolate the impacts for the entire area as well. And it also generates a flood extent layer as well. Next slide. And each time you run the model, it creates this output report. And this is really important because if you're like us and we've run the model dozens of times, this first section describes exactly what the model parameters you put into that tool are, so you can remember what you did. On the next slide, it shows the erosion damages. So this comes up with, tells you the area lost, the volume lost, and then also estimated dollar values of erosion, as well as some information about each transect. And what we did was each time we'd run the model, we'd put this into a spreadsheet so we can start to compare values from different scenarios. And on the next slide, there's information about the flood damages. I found this was a really useful tool. I've been involved in projects before where we've had to kind of manually estimate the flood damages, and it can be very time consuming. So it's really nice to be able to get this information in a click of a button. So this gives information about numbers of structures flooded and estimated damages to building structures. This is likely an underestimation of damages, since we didn't have values to estimate the value of contents in buildings in this area. And lastly, there's also, this report is available on a web page with an interactive ability, which is quite nice. You can select a single profile line, and you can, as you kind of move your cursor along the line, you can get various information about, you can see how the wave height changes as the storm approaches the shore and might be broken by the foreshore or added vegetation. And it's a nice way to visualize the results of the project. And I don't have an example of it here, but you can also export these profile lines to a tool called Shiny through a website. And you can look at each profile and start to explore, instead of running the entire model, you can just look at one profile, and in real time you can see the impact of how changes to a parameter in real time, very quickly can reduce the erosion or flood damages. So it can be a way to then explore the parameters that most impact flooding and erosion, and then run the model for the entire area again. So anyway, I hope you enjoy this demonstration, and I think this model has great potential. Thank you, and I'll pass it back to Michelle Molnar to wrap up.
Wonderful. Thank you, James. So before we turn to questions and discussion, I thought I'd share some lessons learned and as well as next steps. In terms of lessons, one of the biggest benefits of this work was it provided communities with that evidence base. With some communities, we found that it reinforced the value of strategies that were already under consideration. In some cases, in some scenarios, it provided evidence to pursue new incremental or transformative actions to reduce risk. And I note mostly there, I think one of the biggest drawbacks we recognized when we were running this was the realization that the model really doesn't perform well on rocky coastlines for erosion. So definitely we realized the challenges of trying to develop a model for coastlines across Canada, and could be, a definite next step to refine that piece. Secondly, we found that participation in the project increased everyone's understanding of the processes driving coastal erosion and flooding, and therefore management levers. The other piece, closely tied to this is due to the complexity and the ever-changing nature of coastlines, the complementary role of natural and engineered assets was really driven home. And then thirdly, the need for broad collaboration was driven home. This includes collaboration with different levels of government, with key community members, and within local governments or regional governments themselves. And I think James has spoken to this quite well. In terms of next steps, I think we're still processing the results of this project, but at a minimum, I made a few points here. The first one is further review of the model. This could include testing the model against the results of other existing models, sharing it with additional types of coastlines. So really refining that piece again. And then to pick up on the collaboration point and the lessons learned, we've thought about running projects with multiple communities sharing a similar coastline and similar risks, right? Particularly when we're thinking about adaptation, coastal adaptation. One community doing something probably is going to be pretty difficult. So how do we improve that collaboration by projects that work with multiple communities? And then we've also thought about transferring the model to an online environment for increased accessibility. And could be useful once we've refined it a little. Oops, sorry. So here's resources. I know that this slide deck will be shared with you, but I wanted to send the link for the Coastal Toolbox itself. Just a note of some needs before downloading the toolbox. You'll need R for Windows and R ArcGIS Bridge for ArcMap. The guidance document provides steps for downloading those if needed. I provided a link for the guidance document, and you can obtain that in either English or French, as well as the case studies if you want to dig into how we ran each project in the communities, then you can get all of the details there. And with that, I'll turn it back to John to lead us through questions and answers.
Thanks, Michelle, and James and Michelle. That was fantastic, and I'm glad we have a lot of time for questions here because we do have a few great ones. And also thanks to the pilot communities because they were crucial to have a place to test this work out. I guess I'll start with a question. The two pilots were on marine coastal areas. Does this have applicability to the Great Lakes or larger lake environments?
It's a good question. And we have received that question as we were testing this model. The Great Lakes, I'm not sure. We haven't, the model was built for marine environments, but it's one of those key questions for us. So certainly interested in exploring that.
Thanks, Michelle. And I'll get into our questions here. The first one is on beach nourishment. Looks fantastic. I'm curious, where is the sand sourced from and how is it stored and transported? And then also curious to know if the planning estimates developed from the toolbox would forecast any impact increases to taxes in order to fund the projects.
Great. It sounds like that's related to the Point de Chêne example. So I don't know a lot about the beach nourishment program and how it's managed, but the source of the sediment is off of the the sediment is moved through natural processes, kind of from the eastern side of the beach to the west out into the bay. So the beach nourishment moves the sediment that's been moved offshore back kind of to the eastern side to help replenish the sediment source and kind of to help maintain the beach and dune environment. I'm not sure about the cost, but that's definitely an interesting question and something that could be explored through this type of model.
Thanks, James. And this one's directed at Michelle Molnar. Has MNAI worked directly with any First Nations to assess risks associated with sea level rise and plans for adaptation?
No, this was our first foray into coastal natural asset management. So not at this time, the answer is, but certainly interested in it.
And our next question is on the Local Service District Advisory Board for James. Did you have a response for that, or did you want to follow up after the call?
I can certainly follow up after the call. Yeah, and then if you're interested in seeing the participants, it's available in the pilot report as well. But I've sent you my email address and be happy to follow up on that.
That's great. Not sure who this would go to, but do you use indicators to assess the results of the restoration? Are they multidimensional, like social, environmental, and economic?
We used a range of indicators to identify the scenarios that we were modeling, which included social, environmental, and economic and technical. But I would have to ask James or Michelle in terms of follow-up what you're tracking in your communities.
Yeah, I would say in the case of Gibson's, when we make recommendations, when staff will make recommendations to council about next steps for restoration projects, at that point we would be creating our metrics, our indicators for to see if we're meeting our objectives.
And do you need any kind of prerequisite information for the program?
There's certainly data needs, which we cover in the guidance document. We provide, where possible, a few options for gathering that data. But otherwise, no, I don't think so.
I guess, do you need to be a GIS analyst or a GIS training to use the tool?
I could speak to that. So I do not have a background in GIS, and I once the guidance document came out and I had a chance to read through it, then we did a training session with ESSA Technologies. So James was there, myself, and I was able to follow along, which I was quite pleasantly surprised. So it was, and through that process too, we identified any gaps in the guidance document that could help local governments be able to use this and to be able to use it unassisted.
No, that's great. Yeah, I think that's crucial. We have a good question from Enda here. He said, great presentation. Curious as to why the fairly narrow focus emphasizing on natural assets. It seems to me that the tool like this could be modified for broader applications to guide strategic planning, i.e. including both natural and gray assets, but also to consider other risk management strategies like planned retreat or building level flood resistance measures.
I'm happy to jump in here. So I think that what we found was that, like James had mentioned and myself, that even though we didn't see significant flood reduction benefits from using natural assets, at least we explored that option. And so we know all the options that could be potentially available to us. And then the outputs from this model will help guide our decision making moving forward as far as, do we start looking at planned retreat, or do we start looking at engineered alternatives that our first hope would be to use natural assets, but and Michelle mentioned this as well, using natural assets along engineered assets to provide multiple benefits.
Yeah, I can follow up as well. I think, really the focus of the pilot was on natural assets. But, I also see the potential where you can calculate depth damage or building damages as well. You can explore, different scenarios around around retreat or different planning measures. Like in Point de Chêne, there's a planning bylaw to ensure that new development is adapted to a certain elevation. So it could provide a way to estimate the benefits of programs such as that. So yes, I think there are some potential to expand beyond just natural assets.
Agreed. And I'll just note that one of the appendices in the guidance document does cover, engineered as well as natural assets. And what we weren't able to get to within this project was combining some of those options or combining multiple natural asset options. So each of the results that Michelle and James spoke to were based upon running single scenarios. But I think that starting to group those together and starting to look at some hybrid scenarios could be really interesting.
The next question here kind of gets into future planning scenarios. So it's interesting / worrisome that the damages from one big storm at Point de Chêne was 2.8 million, are about half the value of the damages from a 100-year storm. Does that imply that managed retreat is the most prudent strategy to avoid rare but big damages, even with natural assets added for various benefits?
Yeah, that's a big question. Yeah, so there's I'm not sure where those, if you brought those numbers from the example I gave through, that was more of a just for demonstration purposes. Should refer to the report for the exact flood damages associated with different storms. But there is definitely, yeah, I know management retreat isn't a topic that's received, has been, I guess, difficult subject to broach, especially on a community-wide scale. There's been some communities that have, through provincial funding, looked to relocate certain houses, for example, through provincial programs. But yes, certainly managed retreat would be an option, as well as others.
Thanks, Jane. And you acknowledge that the models have underlying the tool have some limitations. Does the guidance document explain to users in which circumstances these models are good enough and when more advanced or alternative modeling approaches are required?
Yeah, the guidance document does go into the limitations of the model quite well. I think that we've often referred to it in the project meetings as a screening tool. And so ideally it should help if it fits for your community, give you that first pass and help you to prioritize perhaps where you might really want to focus some more in-depth studies.
And could this be used like on an individual property scale? Could a homeowner use this if they were doing any kind of management on their land? Or
I would think so, wouldn't you, James? You would draw the transect right up to the individual property line. So I do think you could use it to inform your coastal property.
Yeah, no, I would think so too. You just have a smaller study area just with the area around your property and yeah, and examine the transects in that location.
oh, interesting. Does Parley Beach Provincial Park have a role in the partnership and participation in dune restoration and beach replenishment?
There was in the pilot, Parley Beach was involved, you know, and the dunes and the beach are within their lands. And I know they are involved in the beach nourishment program, for example. But I really can't speak to the exact details.
And I guess kind of a follow-up on that, given that the Parley Beach dune and sandbars are the best natural assets to protect Pointe du Chien from flooding, what complementary engineered solutions might complete the flood protection strategy?
Yeah, I mean, there could be several others. Again, that's a bit outside of the scope of this project, you know, where we were looking at natural assets. But, you know, in the Parley Beach area, you know, because during a storm surge, water is elevated, not just from the waves, that the water can come around the dunes to create flooding. And there's lots of land on the western side and eastern side of Parley Beach for the floodwaters to enter the community. So that would probably require much more in-depth study using probably a lot more sophisticated tools than the more simple storm surge model used in this project.
It's great to see we have a comment from a resident from one of the case studies, Pointe du Chien again. I'm wondering who is responsible for ensuring that the next steps are moving forward and that the information in the modeling is being utilized. Yeah,
so I mean, the goal of this project was really as a test case. You know, we were where there isn't a lot of information about the value of natural assets and how they could be applied. That's really why we as a service commission were interested. So we have these tools available if the community is interested in exploring these solutions further. So, you know, certainly if the community is interested in exploring these further, then, you know, that's why we are trying to build the capacity to support that.
And has the CRC started utilizing the coastal tool to start any analysis on incorporating hard assets into total flood sea level rise mitigation?
No, we haven't. We've focused on, since the pilots wrapped up, we've been creating the data to run it on other areas along the Northumberland Strait. But no, we haven't looked at incorporating hard assets. And I'm not sure this model is the best model to incorporate those.
Thanks, James. I think you've answered the last question we have there. Does the model incorporate kind of seasonal changes? So if you're measuring when, I'm not sure if there's ice in Pointe du Chêne during the winter or not, or can you assess those kind of seasonal effects?
No, the model isn't dynamic. So definitely one of the drawbacks is, you know, if as winds and sands shift, it doesn't provide that type of information. It was just too computationally intensive for a 2D model. But of course, there exist other models that can address that.
I guess Michelle Lewis spoke to doing watershed scale assessment. Is there a separate tool that would combine that with the shoreline one, or how are you bridging those two approaches?
So the model that we're using, the modeling tool that we're using for the source to sea is the stormwater modeling. And I believe that we can't just incorporate the two models, but we're looking at the way that one can inform the other and vice versa. So we're looking at any of the impacts of climate change or development pressure upstream could lead to impacts to the foreshore. And then just looking at that interaction between the creek system and the marine environment.
And I guess for going to like next steps in planning, have you found what kind of response have you received from citizens? Has it been a good tool for informing on impacts and starting conversations?
I can take this one first, James. We just recently did a presentation for the Nicholas Sontag Marine Education Center. They're doing an ocean optimism series. And so myself and Cedar from ESSA Technologies, who was the lead on this project, we presented. And so it was residents in the area that attended the series. And it's just a first step community engagement, just kind of high level of what we found prior to any concrete recommendations that we're going to be making as staff to council for next steps. And I think that until we wrap up the Source to Sea project and we get all the results from that one as well, then that way we'll be able to have a more comprehensive strategic plan moving forward.
Great, thanks everyone for a very informative and also efficient webinar today. That was great. Glad we had a lot of time for questions and could get to everything. And thanks for taking time to present your work.